Is suffering ever good news? I'm Caleb Abernathy, one of the pastors at Christ Memorial Church, and we're beginning our Advent devotionals. This week we're thinking about the promise of the Son. Today, the promised Son's suffering. How was the suffering of the Son promised, and why should his suffering be considered good news for you today? First, think about the promise. The whole of the Old Testament, not just a few prophecies, promises that the Son would suffer. It's promised in Genesis 3, right after Adam's sin, when Adam and Eve are promised a seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, but that his heel will also be crushed. It's a prediction of suffering for their future seed. And it's promised in Genesis 22 through Isaac, Abraham's beloved son, who he puts forward as a sacrifice, but whom God spares and provides his own sacrifice, prophesying a time when God would put forward his own son, the greater seed of Abraham, as a sacrifice. It's promised all throughout the Psalms, particularly the Psalms of David, who suffered throughout his life. Think of the language of Psalm 22, where he talks about being poured out like water, all of his bones being out of joint. This prophesies of the greater Son of David who would come and suffer at the hands of God's enemies. It's promised in the words of one of Israel's prophets, Isaiah, who predicted that the Messiah would end Israel's exile when he writes, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." The promise of the Old Testament is clear. The Son who must come is a Son who must suffer. Because only in suffering could this promised Son pay for the sins of his people. And Jesus was such a Son. The seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham, the greater Son of David, the man of sorrows. Matthew tells us he was named Jesus because he would save his people from their sins, and he did that through the suffering and death he experienced on the cross. So the promise of the Son is the promise of a suffering and dying Son. And that's good news for you today, Christian, because whatever trouble you're facing, and you're surely facing some trouble, it's not the greatest trouble. It's not God's wrath. It's not payment for your sin. That has been graciously removed through the promised suffering Son.